going to be on Peggy Zehring. We're here in her studio in La Veta, Colorado, outside of La Veta, about 12 miles actually. And it's a wonderful studio. Today I found out it's a recreation of her studio in Seattle. Peggy Zehring has spent her life working on her art and has moved throughout the country and has been familiar with different art worlds around the world. Her interest in third world countries has brought her to many interesting places where she's continued her research, which began during her studies on the work of Kandinsky. She has had a lifetime of teaching and soul searching using what she gathered from Kandinsky as her work on her inner self. Kandinsky, along with Franz Marc, created the group called the Blue Rider. Kandinsky searched for a spiritual reality as expressed in one of his paintings, a figure on horseback, and he was searching for his individual meaning. Part of Kandinsky's intention and of his group, the Blue Rider, was to publicize their philosophy in the Blue Rider Almanac, first published in 1912. It emphasized the idea of a multifaceted art style: folk, primitive art, children's sketches, Asiatic, African, medieval woodcuts, and ritual sculpture. Although there is no evidence that Kandinsky was directly influenced by primitive art, it was the idea of ritual and the spiritual as related to the primitive experience that may help in our understanding of his work. Kandinsky's personal aesthetic theory dominated the ideas of the Blue Rider in Munich. In his published work entitled Concerning the Spiritual in Art, Kandinsky suggests that art learns from the objective world and enters a new subjective realm based on the artist's inner needs. In many works, he uses representational subject matter and abandons it as the imagery becomes completely abstract, dependent on the subjective reality of the artist. In Peggy's work, we see a lot of her inner exploration. She has spent a lifetime using many forms that she finds in nature, the objective world, and then she takes from them, she abstracts from them to bring herself through another level of understanding. And today we're going to interview Peggy, who's here in the studio, and we're going to ask her directly about her methods and her philosophy of teaching, and basically what fuels her creative spirit. Elaine de Kooning's paintings are full of spontaneity and improvisation, not remotely finished or suggestive of completion. In other words, the style of the second-generation abstract expressionist of the 40s. The reason I'm mentioning Elaine is because you've spoken about studying with her and how much she's influenced you. And the idea of subject or content was highly debated by the first generation of abstract expressionists, who were really relating their art to the dissolution of the world which they envisioned because of World War II and the possibility of the atomic bomb. So this idea of content in art becomes very important, and I'm curious about your influence of working with de Kooning, and also where you connected or where your ideas diverge. Would you care to elaborate?
Sure. I'm going to be honest. I was never particularly compelled by her work, but I studied with her in I got my fine arts degree in 1977 in Chicago, and then I moved to Seattle in 79. And my experience getting my fine arts degree was quite unique. The University of Illinois in Chicago was completely Bauhaus oriented, all of the departments, architecture, fine art, design, and it was a such a new concept for me. I was still confused when I moved to Seattle, and I was there alone, and I tried to talk to people about what my school was like, and I have to say, my teachers had a kind of religious fervor about the Bauhaus and Kandinsky and Buckminster Fuller especially, and I had no idea how, although I understood the philosophy, understood where they were coming from, I had no idea how it was going to play out in terms of my work. And so I asked, I knew I wasn't finished studying, I'd asked people to help me, nobody could understand what I was talking about. And I actually got politely asked to leave several classes that I had signed up for, because they just said, we don't know what you're talking about. So I decided, well, if nobody will take me as a student, then I'll teach. So I wrote out a lesson plan, and guess what? Everybody hired me that I took it to, because they'd never heard of such a thing.
Interesting.
So anyway, I was still in quite a bit of confusion, and when I found out that Elaine de Kooning was going to be nearby teaching a master painter's workshop for 3 weeks, I, of course, signed on. Mm-hmm. I wanted to know more about where I'd been. You'd think I would know of anyone, if anyone would, but actually, it's turned out that my students have been my best teachers, because I've watched them play out the Kandinsky philosophy. I don't know if you realize that Kandinsky wrote the fine art philosophy for the Bauhaus, mm-hmm. and it was all his doing. So I've been teaching his philosophy and his lesson plans for 30 years now.
Well, I'm very curious. So while you were going to school, you were taking notes on what they were teaching, or years later in retrospect, you could remember what happened in these studios and recreated it by your memory, or this is very interesting.
Both.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, I had one teacher that was so quotable. In fact, more than one that was so quotable, I would just sit and copy down what they said. And I found myself saying those things to my own students.
Very interesting.
They were so propelled, so inspired mm-hmm. by the whole movement, and they were convinced, and I'm convinced as well, that Kandinsky, who was fueled by the Bauhaus, was fueled by Frank Lloyd Wright, Buckminster Fuller, that what they were part of was a swing of the dialectic of art history, from beauty to truth. And they used to say form follows function, so truth over beauty.
But didn't Buckminster Fuller and Frank Lloyd Wright follow Kandinsky?
No, actually, Frank Lloyd Wright had a show in Weimar, Germany in 1911, which just blew everybody's minds. And the intelligentsia of the time gathered around the Frank Lloyd Wright show and decided that they would build a Center for New Age Visuals, which became the Bauhaus in 1917. And it included people like Einstein and a lot of really New Age thinkers.
And Buckminster Fuller?
He was part of that.
Interesting.
He is actually the one, I have a video of Bucky Fuller talking about, actually he's such an amazing thinker, mm-hmm. Actually showing that beauty does follow truth, but truth does not necessarily follow beauty. And that's what this whole thing was about, mm-hmm. an emphasis back on truth.
Well, it's also interesting because similarly in Russia at the same time were the supremacists, Malevich, Chaznik, Elizitsky, and they were working on a new world order similar to Buckminster Fuller, and but their way was a little divergent from this, because what they were interested in was creating a utopian society where people would live in comfort and they would have all their needs met because it was coming out of the Russian Revolution. Whereas with Kandinsky, he was not so interested in politics or social order. And I'd say you're not either.
No.
No.
No, I'm not interested in political art.
No.
I think that those people have proven that that didactic approach is pretty stilted. And I just don't happen to feel like there's any passion in it.
Well, what about Malevech's white on white or black on white?
Well, I love Malevich. I mean, and Kandinsky is also from, I think they share a lot. Wasn't Kandinsky born in Russia?
Yes.
I think. And so they're all coming from a place of change. It was a very fertile time of change. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, and I also just want to point out that also happening at the same time was the emergence of the ethnographic museum. And there was the museum in Paris called the Trocadero. And in that museum, they raised the level of ethnographic masks, which I see you have full of in this studio, which you'll tell us about in a little bit, and other utilitarian objects from primitive society. And they were displayed in a way that put them in the realm of an art museum. And all of the major artists, Picasso, Matisse, Franz Klein, Franz Marc, and the other Blue Rider groups went to see those displays, and that also influenced them. Plus, all the Asiatic art coming of the Japanese woodcuts, which then inspired the printing of their manifestos and their magazines. So you're right, it was an incredibly fertile period. But what interests me is why, and your degree was finished in 77, so I assume you started in 73.
That was my second degree, so,
Right, but that period of 73 to 77, why was this group in Chicago? This was a period also fertile in American art history of minimalism, and it was the precursor to post-minimalism and postmodernism. Why were they so involved in this one aspect in neglect of all of the other things going on in the art world?
The University of Illinois in Chicago, where I got my fine arts degree, was sort of the baby of Mayor Daley. He decided, it was sort of an ego trip on his part, that he, having the university in the city, he only wanted instructors from Black Mountain, IIT, and all of them had to be Bauhaus oriented. That was his idea. And the whole campus was built around the Bauhaus architectural principles, and their architecture school still is very famous.
Is that because of the international style there and the Seagram's building? And
well, I mean, there are lots of
emanated?
examples of what has come out of it, but I think we can really attribute it to Mayor Daley.
Interesting.
Who had a total grasp of things, and I think it was a very exciting time. Meanwhile, the Art Institute in Chicago had the Harry Who at the time, which personally I've just never been that taken with. So
now I'm not familiar with his work. Is he a representation?
No, Harry Who is a group of sort of cartoon kind of
Yes,
psychedelic.
I have seen their work in Chicago.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was sort of the happening.
That was sort of the happening
flower
moment,
power
time of the moment.
Style of art. Right?
Whereas Mayor Daley went for the long term, in my opinion.
Interesting.
Really solid.
So in a way, even though you say that your philosophy is not based on politics, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, if it weren't for the political understanding of Mayor Daley, you would not have had that experience, which basically has changed your life.
I was the beneficiary of the political scene, but I didn't create it, and I wouldn't. I've never tried to make my art political. It's coming from much more of a personal place. And when you were talking about primitive art that can't not be made, that's what I'm most compelled by.
The ritual.
Art that couldn't not be made. It was made from a place that was so emotionally charged
that the artist was compelled to make it. There was no way not to make it. That's been the most, so that's what I like to study. And-
So then that totally discounts conceptual art, idea art, everything that's happened in the last 40 years in America.
Well, not necessarily. I would say nobody is in a vacuum.
No.
I mean, we can pretend that we live in a vacuum and that we're only influenced by one thing, but I don't believe that. David and I, my husband and I, travel to New York twice a year. We love New York. I've had 2 shows in New York, and I plan to continue showing in New York, and I'm very excited by contemporary art, period. So I mean, all that plays in too. But I should just say that my personal love is the primitive and going. I really do believe that the ancients knew more than we do.
Well, the integrity of your work speaks through each piece. We can see that you mean business. And
Well, it's been an evolution, a path of evolution. But
and your adherence to the symbol, repeated in many forms, has been described as the opposite of illustrating, as in tantric illuminated manuscripts, different levels of spiritual development or kundalini energies, chi energies. And you speak of that a lot with your Tai Chi work and your love and your devotion to the Tao. But instead, your mixed media works express the action of that energy exchange, circulation. And can you explain that as a universal truth in a way that people can understand the energy exchange in your work and the manifestation of your philosophy?
I had a 30-piece show in Taipei, Taiwan in 2004, and it was organized and presented by one of my Tai Chi teachers, who told me at the time, well, all your work is about feng shui. And at the time I just went, whoa, of course it is. But I think every artist paints who they are and where they are.
Self-portraits.
So everything's a self-portrait. And I'm very devoted to the study of the Tao and Tai Chi and Feng Shui and I Ching.
Can you explain Feng Shui for us?
So Tai Chi, Tai means man, and we all know Chi means energy. So it's the internal energy of a person that Tai Chi concentrates on. Feng Shui is actually the energy that circulates in a person's environment. And when the energy is flowing smoothly, things happen better. Everything's more fluid. And I guess that's what I'm after in my work. Also, I love sword, and it's a whole body movement. And so that's what I want in my work. I want a whole body movement, not just fingers or an arm, but the whole body out of the feet is what it's about.
So that, in a way, leads me to another aspect of your work. Earlier on in the 80s, when you were creating I-A-E-I-O-U, and now we only have O-A-U, or you in English. I think I'm transcribing in other languages or channeling from you. From the other side. Oh, well, that's another aspect and I'll get back to the earlier work in the 80s. Your upbringing was quite interesting, and I think this plays into your search for inner truth. And your work is a little more based on philosophy and the depth of human experience. And I think a lot of people may not be aware of where you grew up and your connection to the other world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
My family established a funeral home in the middle of Kansas in 1886. and my uncles and my parents, both of them, and my brother and my cousins were all involved. And I realized at one point that my grandparents actually did seances in the funeral home,
Wow.
calling spirits.
I didn't realize that.
I hadn't realized it when I was young, but I spent a lot of time in the funeral home, and I was aware of spirits and ghosts, and I've always seen them. I thought everybody saw ghosts, but I guess I've become aware that not everybody sees ghosts like I do, or feels the energy. There's always this kind of breeze, cold air, and then I've had several experiences with ghosts.
Since our initial meeting here in your studio a few weeks ago when we were discussing the exhibit at the museum, which opens in August, which is still a little ways away, I've been affected by our conversation. And I knew people in the small neighborhood I grew up in, Brooklyn, which was very ethnic, very Italian, and I knew the funeral home owners. But when I was very young, I have memories of going to people's living rooms where the dead were interred. And these were poor people of the community who couldn't afford to go to the funeral homes. And that is a very indelible memory in my mind.
Was that like a wake?
It was the wake that they would have in the actual living room of the house.
Mm-hmm. And I think that all levels of society engaged in wakes. It was a Catholic thing, wasn't it?
It was Catholic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'll never forget my grandfather lying in a wake and being quite taken by it. I think it was 5.
Well, I think probably all Christian groups participate in wakes. I think it's just Judaism that have sittings that they don't see the dead person in wax, which is very frightening to little children. But growing up in that atmosphere of knowing that the bodies were being delivered and they were being cared for and embalmed and
by my brother and my father and my uncles,
and did your mother also participate?
she did the hair on
The hair.
on the women.
So that must have had a very huge effect on your unconscious and
I suppose.
and your search, for meaning, because you were confronted with death continually.
I guess I've always believed that we have many lives, and so I guess you could say I have more of a Buddhist approach to it all. I don't think that we possibly could have one life. I think many lives.
You think that we come back?
We come back. Yes, I do believe it takes a lot of tries to perfect it.
Well, I'd say you're pretty high up on the hierarchy.
Well,
right
I
there.
have no idea.
I mean, you're living your creative life, you're teaching, you're sharing your philosophy, and you're going to have a show at the Museum of Friends. And I'd like to ask you about that before we move on. There are some aspects of your work I'd like to delve into.
Sure.
But an artist that has played a big role in the museum is Richard Mock, and he also is an artist that we respect very dearly and greatly, because my husband Brent and I have a huge amount of his work separately before we even got together, and then we joined the collection. Now they're having babies in the corner. No. no, cut that part. Anyway, he was an abstract painter. And at the end of his life, he was confronted with many physical challenges. He was diabetic, and he died, I'd say, about 3 years ago. And his work was very heavily influenced by the primitive mark making. And I've had extensive conversations with him. He was my mural partner. We did a lot of work together. And he was very convinced that the way society is going is not the correct way, that the real way is to connect to our past. And you know, today people don't like the use of the word primitive. They'd rather indigenous, ancestral. You know, there's a lot of controversy about semantics, and Goldwater in his book of Primitive Art talks about that. But basically, this notion of repetition and the ritual of art making is something that's shared by many of the artists in the collection of the Museum of Friends. And I know that you're familiar with a lot of different venues for showing your work. And why did you agree to show at the museum?
Well, I was excited when you and Brent came from New York and set up a museum in Walsenburg, our little county here in Colorado, because of course I'm devoted to New York as a center of art because it's so diverse, and I've just learned so much in New York. And so I welcomed you immediately. It was like, whoa, we have an opportunity here to elevate the consciousness of the whole county and this whole part of Colorado. And I think you guys in particular, and I also established the Levita School of the Arts here. So, and that's been received pretty well, but with some confusion. And I think there's been some confusion with you because we are out-of-towners coming into a place in Colorado that is not used to thinking about art in the greater sense of art. And so maybe I saw that mutual struggle that we were fighting here. And I think it's just such a great blessing for this part of the country. We're lucky to have you, and I think we're lucky to have the Levita School of the Arts as well. There are so many talented artists in this area, and Kenny is one of them.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I keep coming back to politics, and I know that you say that your work is not political, but we're confronted daily in Wilsonburg with the social demise of our culture and the low economic status of our community, the lack of opportunity, the child abuse, the abuse of families. It's a very tough neighborhood. And I think even though you may not deliberately want to affect politics, by sharing your philosophy and sharing your way of manifesting beauty or manifesting truth can only have a political effect if it's done, you know, repeatedly and over time. And just yesterday, someone came into the new space, the downstairs space of the museum, and mentioned that Walsenburg needs a school, like the Levita School of the Arts. And I've been wrestling with that because both of us, as you know, the co-founders of the museum, which is Brent and myself, we're so overextended at the moment and we don't have much support that the notion of opening a school is really at the heart of what our mission is. And we're very hopeful that our association with you might garner some expertise in this area or some direction that we too could present to the community of Walsenburg what you've presented to Levita, which is very powerful and very important.
I would really welcome that collaboration, for sure. And our passion, while we offer a wide range of, I feel, great creative opportunities to our community, it's the children are our future, and I think our passion are the children's classes that we offer. And we give at least 30 scholarships to children every year, every summer. And I think I would especially welcome that in Walsenburg. That's so needed.
It's so needed.
The children are our future.
The challenges that we were talking about that you've experienced in Levita, letting the word get out and an understanding of what you're doing is a big challenge. And I had been working with the benefactor of the museum, who was interested in working on a mural where we would redo a mural that's in very bad state in the downtown area of Walsenburg. And the notion that I wrote about, and it was extensive research that I shared with this benefactor, of how you create social change, how you elicit agreement about public art. That's been my background, public art, and creating murals and gardens and banners, and 2 of them are at the county courthouse right now that's still up from a public art 1% for the arts. And what the plan was to have our world. Where's Walsenburg was the notion, the content of the mural. And I was away for a few months, and when I got back, this notion of creating change and letting the children envision a new world for their community was squashed. And through this response of community and asking people what they wanted, they want the contributions of the pioneers, the history of the hardness of living in the Werfenau County, how hard life was, how the challenges to the pioneers was so important. And in a way, that's negating who the children are and how they are our future. And if we continually just look backwards and we don't look forwards, there will be no change. And that's the challenge in Walsenburg.
I agree. We've experienced the same thing in Levita, especially when we first arrived. There were no programs for children at all. There was children were not really given any opportunities, and I felt a kind of surliness with the teenagers.
What does surliness mean?
Kind of sneers on their faces and not happy.
Cynical?
Cynical. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of programs for seniors when we first came, but nothing for children. Not much, anyway. Maybe the 2 weeks in the summer with one program, but that was it. So let's see, we've done 4 teenage public works projects, murals now. We've done 2 park benches and 16 banners for Main Street. And all of them are teenage public works projects. We have a program for classes for the younger children, but mostly our concentration with the teenagers has been public works. And it's so fun to see their smiles and their pride when they're
giving
showing
back to the community. And
yes, and their investment in the community and the beautification of their community is so important.
it's so great.
I see a big change.
One question I have is about these earlier pieces from the early 90s. And the title of these 3 is OAU from the series AEIOU. And these 3 are the only left because the others were sold. And I'm very particularly interested in these because they exhibit more of a painterly approach. And during this style of yours, or this period of yours, when you're still exploring the symbol, you're also working more as a painter with brushes, I would assume. There's a little collage element in there. There's more of a painterly approach. And in your later works, where you use the found objects as the armature, and you then build up the surface to create these bas-reliefs, you abandon that. And I'm curious, do you have another side to you, like watercolors or sketchbooks, where you're still exploring work as a painter, or do you only create the bas-relief?
No, I see myself as a painter. I always have been. Since I was a child, paint has been important. As a matter of fact, I see this as a stepping stone toward this.
Yes.
And I don't think I used a brush at all on anything.
Well, what did you use?
Oh, anything. I mean, my whole class is, the way I work too is with found objects, tools that I have my favorite.
Can you show us some?
Sure. Whoa, I have a whole box of tools here. Just various. This is just a wonderful tool.
Wow.
It's a comb.
So you don't use brushes?
I not very often. No, not really. This is a great tool. I mean, I use a lot of. I use a lot of
Palette
knives.
knives.
Or no, these are, what are they called? Spatulas maybe, and windshield wipers and just all kinds of things. These are great. This is great. I love this and
It's a trowel.
and this, and I was using them even on those early pieces. I've always really explored unusual tools.
But my question remains, do you maintain a sketchbook? How do you, because your color is very fabulous, your use of color is wonderful. Do you have a place where you just play with color, where you use brushes, where you use watercolor or washes?
I play all the time. I consider everything I do play. I don't really, I think I just play and make things and then I put them together. And so that's what this process wall is about. Just things I find and I'm experimenting. Look at, isn't this cool? Look at that. I mean, that's the future. Isn't it? I mean,
Well, I could see that as a component of one of your works.
yes, exactly.
And,
And this and
And this whole process wall will be exhibited during the show that we're having, which incidentally is called Peggy Zehring in Process. And the reason that I wanted to have these components, may I?
oh, sure.
Is to show the evolution of how you design these works and how you create them. And there's a great sense of spontaneity in these forms that you maintain throughout your finished works. But I wondered if you ever considered using these solely without the application of the other materials that you use, just as an assemblage.
Well, I did a whole series of things like the piece above the door there, made from found objects that someone just dropped in my driveway one day.
That
But
will
I-
be part of the exhibit at the museum, and that will create an entrance for where the exhibit is going to be placed, and I think that's a fabulous piece.
And you see them on the outside of my studio too.
Yes.
So I've always been interested in just mark making, which you touched on
Yes.
briefly, but mark making and the idea of found objects has always been behind everything that I do, both. And this has a lot to do with just mark making.
Mark making.
Yeah, and so the more unusual the tool, often the better the mark.
Well, if we can stay with this notion then, if we look at the color, the applied color here, there's nothing on this surface that was added with the brush. It was all either a tool, an implement, something, but no brushes.
Well, hockey, I used hockey brushes for this.
For the smooth surface.
Yeah, for the smooth surfaces.
Okay.
The hockey brushes, meaning the stitched Japanese soft brushes that do so well with blending colors.
Blending.
But you know, this
this whole series of paintings, which I call the harnessing series.
Yes, can you speak a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
I found this old disintegrating tent in my favorite junkyard in Manassas, and so I was just so taken with, especially the leather buttons and the wooden struts and the metal pieces. So I started attaching them to canvas just for fun, because I like playing with stuff, and I really love materials. Chalk dust, marble dust, sawdust, sand. You name it, if I mix it with acrylic medium, I can get it to do amazing things. And so this was originally would have been sand, because I like the way that the texture that's created with sand. However, my pieces started getting way too heavy. So then I started using painter's wall texturizer, which is styrofoam and looks exactly like sand. Cut the weight of my work in half at least, and still gives me the effect of sand. So anyway, a friend came in and saw me working with these materials and said, "Where did you get all this harnessing material?" So that's then the title of the series became Harnessing, from her question. But I like to play things against each other. So I am in a process right now where everything is, I have a golden mean proportion set up before I start any painting at this point in my evolution.
Do you begin with the drawing?
I begin with a proportional drawing. In fact, here's some proportional drawings. It's just the golden mean. And so I set up a golden mean structure before I do anything now. And then I play these all these materials against the structure. So I like the structure to be there, and then the free form whole body. This happens really fast, like a Tai Chi move. You know, like that, really, really fast.
And then you know where to apply the material later? Or do you apply
No, that's the material.
quickly?
Yes, I put it on really, really fast. I maybe spill it on it, but the mark is really, really fast. It's a Tai Chi mark.
So it's very intentional.
Yeah, well, but I never know exactly how it's gonna, because I do it so fast, I never know exactly how it's gonna look. That's the immediacy of it. That's what's so fun. I really like having that. I like building, I like having a process that I follow, but then I like the fact that anything can happen during that process. I like it to play out in not exactly the way I had envisioned even.
So I hadn't thought of this before, but are you influenced at all by the Dada, by Duchamp and Schwitters and
I love
Accident?
that. Accident for sure. And I love the Dadaists. I mean, I've studied them for a long time, but I don't consider myself a Dadaist. Not at all. I'm
I
not
see.
really coming from that place.
You're not at all.
No,
But I'd say that your process might be a little connected. To
I would say my process is more connected to Willem de Kooning and the abstract expressionists.
And that is?
Well, it was so when I teach and when I work with a blindfold now and then, just to get myself into the unpredictable. So I'm not doing things that I think I'm doing. I like to build surprise into my process, and so I do use a blindfold sometimes, and and that's why I like the fast gesture, and I like to surprise myself, and I think that's more of a abstract expressionist thing. Actually, the blindfold was de Kooning's idea, and I teach it now in all my classes. I make everybody wear blindfolds because the marks are so much more honest, and the marks are so much more interesting looking, and they're so much freer.
Sort of like the drawing on the right side of the brain.
Yeah, well, that explains it somewhat, but I think the de Kooning Bauhaus
Method.
approach is a little different than the drawing on the right side of the brain, but I really appreciate that book, and I refer some people to it.
Because it uncovers what is real. Your
Which are, yeah, the
unconscious.
difference between what you really see and what you think you see are so different, and so that's what that book explores. But I think that when I've watched this for 30 years teaching my students, they put on a blindfold, and when they take it off and they see what they've done, a lot of times they cry. It's so truthful. And of
Cathartic,
course,
it sounds.
authentic, because you can't lie with a blindfold on. You are going to do who you are, and that's what Kandinsky believes is the best art. To be the truth of you is the best gift you can give to the culture you exist in. That's his philosophy in a nutshell.
Well, I think that's a good place to end, and I appreciate your honesty.
Sure.
And, really enjoyed being here with you today, and look forward to our exhibit at the Museum of Friends. It'll open on August 14th.
Yes,
And
August 14th.
August 14th, and it'll go through the fall, ending somewhere around November 30th.